The alarms were already screaming when she walked into that trauma bay and did what 3 doctors couldn't. Her hands didn't shake, her voice didn't waver. She looked at a dying man on a gurney, a man whose blood pressure had dropped to nothing, whose veins had collapsed, whose body was shutting down one system at a time. And she saw something no one else in that room saw. She moved, she acted, she saved him. And by 6 o'clock the next morning, the hospital handed her a termination notice and told her to clean out her locker. They called her reckless, insubordinate, a nurse who didn't know her place. What they didn't know, what nobody in that building knew, was exactly who they had just thrown away. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear is only the beginning. Every week we bring you stories like this one, raw, cinematic, and absolutely unbelievable, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. While you're at it, smash that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. Seriously, I want to see how far this story travels. Let me know where you are, and let's find out together just how wide this reach goes. Now, let's talk about the nurse they threw away. The shift started the way most Tuesday nights started at Harmon Valley Medical Center, quietly enough to make you nervous. Nurses who had worked emergency medicine long enough knew that silence in the ER wasn't peace. It was the pause before the drop, the held breath before the wave. Veterans of the department had a word for it, the lull. And the lull always ended. Nora Voss had learned that lesson during her first week, 3 months ago. She was 28 years old, new to the department, new to the hospital, new to Raleigh, North Carolina. Or at least she was pretending to be new to all of it. She had come to Harmon Valley the way some people come to a town after something happens to them, quietly, with a name transfer from a different state and a resume that had a conspicuous 3-year gap that nobody had thought to ask about during the hiring process. She was efficient, she was attentive, she kept her head down and her mouth closed, and she clocked in early and clocked out late, and she never, not once, pushed back when a physician corrected her about something she already knew better than they did. That part, the not pushing back, cost her something every single time. But she paid it. The ER at Harmon Valley was not a kind place to be junior staff. The department was run by Dr. Marcus Felda, chief of emergency medicine, a man who had been at the hospital for 19 years and had calcified somewhere around year 12 into something rigid and territorial. He wasn't the worst doctor Nora had ever encountered. He was competent. He was even occasionally right. But he had a way of looking at nurses, particularly young ones, particularly ones he hadn't personally approved of, that made clear they existed to execute his instructions and nothing more. "You're not here to think," he'd told her during her second week when she'd flagged a medication timing issue on a post-op patient. "You're here to implement." She had nodded and said, "Yes, Dr. Felda." The patient's chart had been quietly corrected by the attending physician the following morning. Nora had not said anything about that either. The charge nurse on her unit was a woman named Bet Simmons, 53, with close-cropped gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that Nora had come to respect in the way you respect a fence. Reliable, clear about where the boundary was, not interested in your feelings about it. Bet ran a clean department. She also ran a department where junior nurses understood exactly where they ranked. "You're good," Bet had told Nora once, after a particularly complicated intake. "Faster than most of the new hires I've seen, but fast doesn't mean much here if you can't follow the hierarchy." "I understand the hierarchy," Nora had said. "I'm not sure you do," Betty had replied, not unkindly. "You carry yourself like someone who's used to making calls. That's going to get you in trouble here." Nora had smiled and changed the subject. She worked Tuesdays through Saturdays, night shift, 11 to 7. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment 20 minutes from the hospital with no furniture worth mentioning and a running habit she maintained like a prescription. 6 miles every morning before sleeping, rain or pavement or nothing. She had 2 friends in Raleigh, both of them casual, neither of them aware of much about her. She called her mother in Boise every Sunday and kept the conversations brief. She was not unhappy. She was also not what she appeared to be. But she had made a decision, after everything that happened, to step back, to be smaller, to take up less space in the world than she actually occupied. And for 3 months, she had managed it. Until the Tuesday night in March when a man named Daryl Pruitt was brought into Harmon Valley ER by ambulance at 11:47 p.m. and everything Nora had been quietly containing came roaring back to the surface. The call came in at 11:38. Multi-vehicle highway accident on I-40, approximately 9 miles east of the city. 2 vehicles involved, a delivery truck and a sedan. Paramedics on scene reported 1 critical, 1 serious, 1 walking wounded. The critical was coming to Harmon Valley. By the time the ambulance doors opened in the bay, Nora was already gloved. She heard the paramedics hand off from 15 feet away, absorbing the key numbers. BP 88/52, heart rate 124, GCS 13, suspected blunt chest trauma, 2 large-bore IVs established en route, 1 liter NS running. The man on the gurney was in his mid-40s, big-built, with a face that had taken some impact. A laceration above his left eye, swelling already distorting the orbital region, lips dry and cracked. He was conscious but not tracking well. His hands were trembling in a way that looked less like fear and more like systemic. Dr. Felda was already in the trauma bay, along with Dr. Pete Okafor, a second-year resident who Nora liked and who was visibly trying to project calm over a face that said something else. "Let's move," Felda said, pulling on gloves. "Get me a portable chest and a fast exam. Start a second large bore if that one's blown." The room moved the way ER rooms moved. Controlled chaos, everyone in their lane, the overhead lights too bright and the sounds layered on top of each other. Nora was at the patient's left side, checking the IV access, running vitals, logging numbers. She was doing her job. She was in her lane. But she was also watching. The chest X-ray came back in 4 minutes. Okafor put it up, and she didn't have to move closer to read it. She'd learned to read imaging in conditions where the light was a headlamp, and the X-ray was someone describing what they saw over a radio. She could parse a chest film faster than most attendings. What she saw stopped her cold. "Dr. Felda," she said. He didn't look at her. "What?" "The trachea. It's deviated, and his breath sounds on the left are— I can hear breath sounds, Voss." "They're absent," she said. "On the left." Felda was already moving to the patient's head, stethoscope in hand. He listened. He straightened. "There's decreased air entry on the left. He's got a hemothorax. We'll chest tube." "The deviation is more than you'd see with a hemothorax at this pressure," Nora said. She kept her voice flat, not arguing, observing. "His neck veins are distended. His BP is dropping. He's been declining for the last 90 seconds. Felda turned and looked at her with an expression she had seen before, the particular look of a senior physician who has just been questioned by a nurse, and who has decided to demonstrate that this will not be tolerated. "I know what I'm looking at," he said. "Start the chest tube setup." Nora turned toward the supply cart. She was pulling the chest tube tray when the monitor screamed. The patient's heart rate spiked to 138, and then the waveform went jagged. His BP, 74/40. His oxygen saturation, 89 and falling. "He's crashing," Okafor said, and his voice cracked on the second word. Felda moved fast. He was good at crisis, whatever else he was, calling for drugs, adjusting the oxygen, running the standard response. But Nora was standing very still for exactly 1 second, watching the monitor, watching the patient's neck, watching his color, and the 1 second was all she needed. She had seen this before. Not in a trauma bay, in a different kind of broken place, where the equipment was whatever you could carry in, and the light was whatever the sky provided, and the man dying in front of you had been alive 40 minutes ago when you were both standing on solid ground. She had seen this 3 times in her life. She had lost one of them. She was not going to lose this one. "Tension pneumo," she said. It wasn't a suggestion. "He needs needle decompression, right now." "Boss?" She was already at the supply cart. She had a 14-gauge angiocath in her hand. Felda's voice went hard. "Do not touch that patient with that needle. His trachea is deviated left, his neck veins are up, his left lung sounds are absent, and he's in obstructive shock," Nora said, turning. She was not shouting. She was the calmest person in the room, which was its own kind of terrifying. "If we tube him right now without decompressing, we'll push the mediastinum further and we'll lose him. You have maybe 90 seconds. The monitor alarm changed pitch. The oxygen sat dropped to 84. Okafor looked at Felda. Felda looked at the monitor. Felda looked at Nora. Something crossed his face. Not agreement, not acceptance, Something more complicated than either of those things. Something that looked like a man doing math he didn't want to do. "Do it," he said. She moved to the patient's left side, located the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line by touch the way she'd been taught in a forward operating base by a flight surgeon who told her to practice until she could find it blindfolded. She could find it blindfolded. The needle went in. The hiss of trapped air releasing was immediate. A sound she had heard before, a sound she would have recognized in the dark. The patient's oxygen sat began climbing within seconds. The jagged waveform smoothed. His color, which had gone ash-gray and frightening, shifted back towards something that meant perfusion. The room was silent except for the monitors. Then, "Chest tube setup," Felda said, and the room moved again. Nora stepped back and let the team work. Okafor caught her eye across the gurney. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The patient, Daryl Pruitt, 44, a regional logistics manager who had been driving home from a late client dinner when a truck drifted into his lane, was stabilized and transferred to the ICU at 2:17 a.m. His attending physician later described his prognosis as cautiously optimistic, which in ICU language meant he was alive and likely to stay that way. In the trauma bay, after the patient was moved and the room was being reset, Nora stripped off her gloves and started on the documentation. She was writing fast, muscle memory efficient, logging the clinical timeline with the same precision she brought to everything. She was aware that Marcus Felda was still in the bay. She was aware he hadn't left. She finished the paragraph she was writing and looked up. He was standing at the far end of the room with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Bet Simmons was near the door, also watching. Okafor had been sent to follow up on the transfer documentation. "You want to tell me," Felda said, "where a new nurse with 3 months on the job learned to perform needle decompression?" Nora set down her pen. "It's in the scope of practice for advanced trained nurses in North Carolina under emergency." "I know what the scope of practice says." He took a step toward her. He wasn't threatening. He was deliberate. "I'm asking how you learned to do it like that. The way you moved. You didn't hesitate." "I recognize the presentation," she said. "From where?" A pause. 1 second too long. "Training," she said. He studied her for a moment. "Your application said you worked ER nursing in Portland for 2 years before you came here." "That's correct. And before that you had a gap." "Personal reasons." "Personal reasons," he repeated. He said it the way people repeat something when they're deciding whether to push on it. Then he uncrossed his arms. "You acted without my authorization. You picked up a needle in my trauma bay and performed a procedure on a critical patient without a direct physician order. You understand what that means." "He would have died," she said. "That is not the point." She looked at him. She kept her face neutral and her voice even, and she said the truest thing she'd said all night. "I know." Felda turned to Bet. Bet's face was professionally blank in the way of someone who has witnessed this kind of conversation before and is not going to make it easier for either party. "Write it up," Felda said. Bet nodded once. "I'll write it up." He left the bay. Bet waited until his footsteps faded down the corridor, and then she looked at Nora with an expression that was not unkind and was not encouraging. "You should have waited for his order," Bet said quietly. "He was going to give it too late." "Maybe." Bet picked up the chart Nora had left on the counter and clipped it. "But now it's an incident report instead of a save, and that's a distinction that matters to the people who read them." Nora looked at the door where Felda had exited. "I know," she said again. "What?" The rest of the night passed in a particular flavor of quiet, not the lull before the storm quiet, but the heavy, accumulated silence of a shift where something significant had happened and everyone was processing it in their own private way. Okafor found her at 4 a.m. in the supply corridor, restocking the secondary crash cart with the methodical focus she brought to tasks she needed to do with her hands when her head was running too fast. "Hey," he said. "Hey." He leaned against the wall. He was 26, slender, with a habit of rolling his sleeves to the elbow and a way of listening that was rarer than it should have been in physicians his age. "You doing okay?" "Fine." "That was—" He stopped. Started again. "I've never seen anything like that. I mean, I've read the presentation. I've trained on it. But the way you were so sure." "I've seen it before," she said. In Portland? She put a saline flush on the shelf. Yes. He looked at her for a moment the way people look when they know the answer they've been given isn't the whole answer, and they're deciding whether to say so. Felda's going to write you up, he said. I know. It might be more than a write-up. She put another flush on the shelf. Nora. He said her name carefully. Holloway. I mean Felda. He has a pattern with staff who challenge him, especially nursing staff. There are 3 nurses who left this department in the last 18 months. Good nurses. And I'm just saying you should be careful. She turned and looked at him properly. He had the face of someone who genuinely wanted to help and genuinely wasn't sure how to do it. Thank you, Pete, she said. And she meant it. He nodded once and left her to the supply corridor. She stood there alone for a moment after he was gone, one hand resting on the metal shelf, looking at a row of saline bags. She thought about the patient in the ICU and the particular hiss of released air and the monitor numbers climbing back from the edge. She thought about the last time she'd heard that sound, in a very different place, under very different circumstances. She went back to work. The incident report was filed at 6:15 a.m. Nora was in the staff lounge, 12 minutes from the end of her shift, changing out of her work shoes into the running shoes she kept in her locker, when Bet came in and sat down across from her. The lounge was empty. The overnight fluorescent lighting made everyone look like they hadn't slept. Bet put a manila envelope on the table. Nora looked at it. She didn't open it. The board convened at 5:45, Bet said. Felda presented the incident. 3 board members were there, including Dr. Sylvia Tron from administration. That was fast. Felda requested it. Nora picked up the envelope. Inside was a single page on hospital letterhead. The language was formal and precise in the way that formal language is when it's designed to cover something ugly in clean sentences. It described a violation of established clinical protocols, an unauthorized clinical intervention, a breach of the supervisory chain of command. At the bottom, in bold, this letter constitutes written notice of termination of employment, effective immediately. She read it twice. Not because she needed to, she understood it the first time, but because she was giving herself the 2 seconds she needed to make sure she didn't react in a way she'd regret in front of Bet Simmons. I see, she said. I want you to know, Bet said, and her voice was quieter than usual, less the charge nurse and more just a person, that I documented the clinical outcome in your favor, the timeline, what you said, what the monitor showed, when the intervention happened. It's in the report. I wanted it on record. Thank you. For what it's worth, and I know this is the wrong time to say it, you were right about the diagnosis, about the timing. It wasn't worth much, Nora said. Bet's jaw tightened slightly. She didn't argue. You can appeal to HR. The process, I won't appeal. Nora folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Bet looked at her. Why not? Nora thought about how to answer that. She thought about the 3-year gap on her resume and the personnel file in a federal record system that would surface things she wasn't ready to have surfaced. She thought about how an appeal meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant questions, and questions meant a conversation she hadn't figured out how to have yet. Because it would create more problems than it solves, she said. For me. Betty was silent for a moment. Then, clean out your locker before 7. Security will need your badge. She stood and left. Nora sat in the empty break room for 4 minutes with the envelope on the table in front of her. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere down the hall, the shift was turning over. The day staff arriving. The overnight staff packing up. The particular noise of a large institution resetting itself. The man she had saved was in the ICU, alive. And she was going to hand her badge to a security guard at the front desk and walk out of this building carrying a box with her extra stethoscope, her compression socks, and the half-finished crossword she kept in her locker for slow nights. She picked up the envelope. She stood. She went to her locker. Wub. Her name badge was still warm from her pocket when she placed it on the security desk at 7:04 a.m. The guard on duty was a young man named Colin, who she had spoken to maybe a dozen times in 3 months, small talk during late nights, the quiet check-in, check-out exchange of people who worked the same building at the same odd hours. He looked at the badge, then at her, and the expression that crossed his face said he'd been briefed already. I'm sorry, Ms. Voss, he said. She had a cardboard box under one arm. It was not heavy. She had not accumulated much. "Take care of yourself, Colin," she said, and she walked through the glass doors into the early morning. The air outside was cold and flat and smelled like rain that hadn't quite decided to fall yet. She stood on the curb for a moment, box in hand, and looked at the parking lot. Her car was in the overflow lot, second row, a gray sedan that she'd driven from Portland with 2 bags in the trunk. She walked to it. She put the box in the passenger seat. She sat behind the wheel for a minute and looked at the hospital building through the windshield. Harmon Valley Medical Center, 12 floors, the emergency department entrance on the south side visible from where she was parked. The ambulance bay lit up even now, even in the early morning, because emergencies did not observe business hours. She thought about the man in the ICU. She thought about the sound of air releasing. Then she started the car and drove home. She ran 6 miles. Not because she felt like it, because she needed her body to be doing something her head couldn't interrupt. She ran the route she always ran, through the residential grid south of her apartment, down the long slope toward the greenway, along the creek path where the trees were just starting to show the first green of early spring. And she ran it faster than usual, and by the time she got back to her building, her lungs were burning and her legs were heavy, and her mind had finally quieted into something manageable. She showered. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table with the termination letter and her laptop, and she spent 40 minutes being practical, checking her bank account, looking at her lease terms, drafting a mental list of next steps that was disciplined and rational and absolutely did not include the thing she was actually thinking about, which was they were never going to let her be small enough. She had tried. She had genuinely tried. She had filed the edges off herself. She had muted the instincts that 3 years of training had made automatic. She had stood in rooms where she could see the answer and forced herself to wait for someone else to find it. She had been patient and deferential and careful. And the one time she had not waited, because waiting would have meant watching Daryl Pruitt die on a gurney while a physician ordered the wrong intervention. They had fired her before his heart rate finished stabilizing. She closed the laptop. She went to her bedroom closet and stood in front of the shelf at the top, the one with the 2 boxes she had not opened since Portland. She looked at them for a long time. Then she put them back and went to the kitchen and refilled her coffee and sat down again and thought about what she was going to do next. She was still thinking about it at 2 in the afternoon when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. North Carolina area code 919, Raleigh prefix. She answered. "Is this Nora Voss?" The voice on the other end was male, measured, with the particular careful diction of someone who was accustomed to giving information very precisely and getting it back the same way. "It is," she said. "Ms. Voss, my name is Sergeant Aaron Briggs. I'm calling from Raleigh PD, but I want to be clear that this isn't a police matter. I'm calling on behalf of someone who wants to reach you regarding a patient at Harmon Valley Medical Center." Nora set down her coffee cup. "I don't work there anymore." "I know," he said. "That's actually part of why I'm calling." A pause. "Ms. Voss," Sergeant Briggs said, "the patient from last night, the one from the highway accident, his family has been asking questions, specifically about the nurse who kept him alive." Another pause, smaller this time, more deliberate. "But there are also some other people asking, people who drove up from Camp Lejeune this morning, and they're not asking about the accident." Nora's hand had gone still on the table. "They're asking," Briggs said, "about you." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the first drops of rain that had been threatening all morning finally made contact with the window. "Tell me," she said carefully, "who they are." "Military," Briggs said. "That's all I can say on the phone. But Ms. Voss." And here he paused again, the third pause, the one that had something in it she couldn't immediately name, until she identified it as the particular timbre of someone telling you something with more weight than the words alone carry. "They didn't ask for a nurse. They asked for someone who served." Her fingers curled around the phone. Outside, the rain came down harder. The boxes in her closet that she had not opened since Portland sat on their shelf in the dark and waited. She didn't answer Briggs right away. The rain was hitting the window in uneven bursts now, the way early spring rain does in North Carolina. Not committed, not a storm, just insistent. She sat with the phone pressed to her ear and listened to the small sounds of the connection and thought about what the word served meant coming from a stranger on the other end of a phone call she hadn't expected. "Where are they?" she asked. "Harmon Valley," Briggs said. They arrived about an hour ago. Asked for you at the front desk. The front desk sent them to administration. Administration told them you'd been let go, and a brief pause. Ms. Voss, they didn't leave. She looked at the window, at the rain. They're still there, she said. Still there. And from what I'm hearing from the shift supervisor, they're not the kind of people you ask to wait in the lobby and expect them to sit quietly with a magazine. She understood what he was not saying. How many? 4 that came into the building. There may be more outside. I didn't get a full count. She was already moving toward the bedroom. Give me 40 minutes. Ms. Voss, 40 minutes, she said, and ended the call. She stood in the middle of her bedroom for exactly 3 seconds, which was long enough to make a decision she'd been postponing for 3 months. Then she went to the closet and reached for the top shelf and pulled down the first box. It wasn't heavy. That was always the thing people didn't understand. The weight of what you carried wasn't in the objects. The objects were just objects. A folded set of service records, a medical certification packet with a federal seal, a small velvet case the size of a deck of cards, a photograph, face down, that she didn't turn over. She put the box on the bed and looked at the contents for a moment. Then she got dressed in something other than running clothes for the first time since 7 this morning, picked up her keys, and walked out the door. The parking lot of Harmon Valley Medical Center looked different at 2:40 in the afternoon than it had at 7 in the morning. The overnight fluorescence was gone, replaced by the flat gray light of an overcast afternoon, and the ambulance bay was running its usual daytime volume, 2 rigs visible, 1 loading, 1 just arrived. She pulled into visitor parking and sat in her car for a moment, looking at the entrance. There was a black SUV parked in the fire lane near the main doors. Then she noticed the second one, farther back, angled to cover the lot's exit. Neither vehicle had plates she could read from here, but the way they were positioned wasn't random. She got out of the car. The automatic doors slid open and the smell hit her. Antiseptic and recycled air and something beneath that, the particular institutional scent of a building that processed human emergencies 24 hours a day. 3 months of working here hadn't made her stop noticing it. She wasn't sure it was possible to stop noticing it. The front desk coordinator, a young woman named Priya, who had always been pleasant to Nora during check-ins, looked up and registered visible surprise before she could compose her face. Ms. Voss, I know, Nora said. I'm not here to cause trouble. There are some people here looking for me? Priya glanced toward the administrative corridor to the left of the main entrance. They're in the conference room. Dr. Tran is with them. A pause. I'm not sure I'm supposed to. It's all right, Nora said. I'll find it. She knew where the conference rooms were. She'd attended one orientation meeting in Conference Room B during her first week and spent most of it assessing the emergency exit locations out of a habit she'd never quite broken. She walked down the administrative corridor. The carpet here was different from the clinical areas. Thicker, quieter, the kind of institutional upgrade that signaled you were in the part of the building meant for administrators and board members rather than patients and staff. Her footsteps were almost silent. Outside Conference Room B, she stopped. She could hear voices through the door. One of them, Dr. Sylvia Trans, measured and administrative, and another she didn't recognize, male, speaking in the clipped cadence of someone who was accustomed to briefings. She knocked once and opened the door. There were 4 of them. That was the first thing she registered. 4 people in civilian clothes seated around the near end of the conference table, and civilian clothes or not. They sat the way she knew how to identify, the particular postural economy of people who had trained their bodies to be ready without looking like they were ready. The one nearest the door was a woman, mid-30s, with close-cut dark hair and the kind of stillness that took years to develop. Across from her 2 men, one compact and watchful, one larger with a scar along his left jawline that was the specific shape of shrapnel work. And at the head of the small cluster, the one who was speaking when Nora opened the door, a man she recognized. Not personally, but the way you recognize certain configurations. He was maybe 42, with the kind of face that had been weatherworked rather than aged. He'd been speaking when she came in, and he stopped, and the 4 of them looked at her, and nobody said anything for a moment. Dr. Tran was at the far end of the table, a yellow legal pad in front of her, and she looked equal parts relieved and alarmed to see Nora walk in. Ms. Voss, Tran started, I want to be clear that the hospital's position, Dr. Tran, the man at the head of the cluster said, without looking at her. He was still looking at Nora. Could you give us a few minutes? It was not phrased as a request in any way that mattered. Tron closed her legal pad, stood, and left the room, pulling the door behind her with the careful precision of someone who was absolutely going to stand 6 feet away from it in the corridor. The room was quiet. Nora stayed near the door. She put her hands in the pockets of her jacket and looked at the man who had spoken. "You've been looking for me," she said. "Since about 9 this morning," he said. He had a North Carolina accent that had been professionally moderated but not entirely erased. "When we found out who your patient was." "I don't know who my patient was," she said. "I know his name was Daryl Pruitt, and he was a logistics manager from the highway accident." The man's expression didn't change much. "That's the cover story that was active. It went into the system when EMS called it in." He folded his hands on the table. "His real name is Thomas Carver. He's a special operations support contractor, formerly Navy, currently assigned to a program I can't name in a room without clearance verification. He was driving back from a logistics meeting that was also not what it looked like." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Is he going to make it?" "ICU's saying yes, because of what you did." The man leaned forward slightly. "I'm Commander Dale Rutherford. This is my team. We were the unit Carver was supporting." The woman near the door nodded once. The compact man and the one with the jaw scar remained precisely as still as they'd been when Nora walked in. "You saved his life," Rutherford said. "We understand there were consequences for that." "I was fired this morning," she said. "We know." "Then what do you want from me, Commander?" He looked at her for a long moment. Not assessing, he'd already done that in the first 10 seconds. She understood that about the way he operated. This was something else. "We want to know who you are," he said. "Because the way you moved in that room last night, we pulled the security footage from the trauma bay. One of our medical officers watched it." He paused. "She said she's seen that specific technique for needle decompression in exactly 2 training programs. One of them is a Special Operations Combat Medicine certification that hasn't been taught to civilian medical personnel in 7 years. The room was very quiet. "Your records from before Portland are—" He stopped. "Interesting. The gap is very clean, almost too clean, which means someone helped you make it clean." Nora looked at the window. Rain was still hitting it, the same uneven rhythm as her apartment window 20 minutes away. "I left the military," she said carefully. "I made a decision to leave and to do something different. That was mine to make." "Absolutely," Rutherford said. "Nobody's disputing that." "Then what are you disputing?" "Nothing." He said it plainly. "I'm not here to dispute anything, Ms. Voss." Or something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of something he'd been working toward. "Should I use your rank?" She looked at him. "Captain," he said quietly. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. The woman near the door was watching her face. The compact man's gaze had shifted slightly. The one with the jaw scar had gone very still in the way that meant he'd been still before, and this was just more of it. "That's not my rank anymore," Nora said. "No," Rutherford agreed. "It's not, but it's what you were." And the person who walked into that trauma bay last night and identified a tension pneumothorax under pressure, communicated it clearly to a senior physician who wasn't listening, and performed a needle decompression with the kind of precision that kept a man alive. That person didn't learn those things in an emergency room in Portland. She didn't answer. "I'm not asking you to come back," he said. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I just want to understand what happened here, because a man I'm responsible for is alive because of a decision you made, and the people who run this building penalized you for it, and that—" He stopped. His jaw moved slightly. "That bothers me considerably." Nora pulled out a chair and sat down. Not because she was ready to trust him, because she was tired and she'd been standing since she walked in, and she was 28 hours without sleep, and had been fired 6 hours ago, and the adrenaline that had carried her through the morning had finally started to thin. "What do you want to know?" she said. She didn't tell him everything. That wasn't how she worked, and she suspected it wasn't how he worked either. And the conversation they had for the next 40 minutes was the kind of conversation where both parties understood that the edges of what was being said were not the edges of what was being thought. What she told him, she had trained as a combat medic after nursing school. She had been selected for an advanced program she did not name. She had served for 3 years in roles she described only as forward medical support. She had left. She had reasons for leaving that she was not prepared to discuss. What he told her, Thomas Carver had been involved in a regional operation she would not be briefed on. His injuries were consistent with a secondary incident that had happened before the highway accident. The highway accident itself had been a separate, mundane event that had compounded an existing problem nobody in the ER would have known to look for. The hemothorax and tension pneumo that developed were partly trauma from the crash, and partly the progression of something that had started hours earlier. Which means, Nora said, that the standard trauma protocol would have missed it regardless. Yes. Because whoever looked at that chest film would have seen the hemothorax and stopped there. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. And you're telling me this because you deserve to know that what you saw was real and specific and not something a general emergency physician would have caught, he said. The deviation pattern, the way the two injuries were presenting together. Our medical officer said it was a 1 in 100 read, even for someone with specialized training. Nora was quiet. You saw it in under 4 minutes from the time the gurney came through the bay door, he said. She looked at the table. I've seen it before, she said. For the second time that day, to the second person. I know, Rutherford said. That's what I mean. She was in the parking lot, sitting in her car with the engine running but not moving, when the knock came on her passenger window. It was the woman from the conference room, the one with the close-cut hair and the specific quality of stillness. She had appeared from nowhere in the way that people trained to move quietly appear from nowhere. She was holding an umbrella, and she was also apparently the kind of person who held an umbrella for other people even in a parking lot conversation. Nora rolled down the window. Lieutenant Petra Moss, the woman said. She didn't offer her hand through the window. She just said her name the way someone says their name when they want you to remember it. I'm the medical officer Rutherford mentioned. The one who watched the footage. Yes. Nora looked at her. What do you want? Moss considered the question with the seriousness it probably deserved. I want to tell you that I've watched that footage 4 times, and every time, the moment that gets me, she paused. It's when Felda says stand down and you're already halfway to the supply cart. You didn't argue, you didn't freeze, you just moved, like you were following a script you'd already written. Nora didn't say anything. I'm not recruiting you, Moss said. Rutherford already told you that. I just wanted to say... She stopped, tried again. I've lost people I shouldn't have lost because the person in the room with the right answer was waiting for someone else to give them permission. She looked at Nora steadily. You didn't wait. I got fired for it, Nora said. Yes. Moss held her gaze, and the man is alive. They looked at each other through the car window in the rain. What happens now? Nora said. That depends, Moss said, on what Rutherford decides to do about what happened to you. A pause. And what he decides to do may depend on what's in your service record, which he's currently requesting through channels that don't require your permission. She said it without apology. I thought you should know. The rain came down. The umbrella kept the worst of it off Moss's shoulder. Why are you telling me this? Nora asked. Moss looked at her for one more moment. Then, because if I were you, I'd want to know when someone was about to find out everything. She stepped back from the car window, turned, and walked back toward the black SUV in the fire lane, the umbrella tilted against the rain, her footsteps not making a sound on the wet asphalt. Nora sat in her idling car and stared at the hospital entrance. When someone was about to find out everything. She had built 3 months of quiet on top of 3 years of silence on top of a life she had decided to walk away from, and she had told herself it was a choice she'd made cleanly and completely, and she had believed that most of the time. She had believed it the way you believe things you've said out loud enough times. The boxes in her closet, the photograph, face down, the velvet case she hadn't opened. She put the car in reverse. She went home. She ran a second 6 miles, which she had never done before in the same day, and she came back, and she could not sit still, so she cleaned her apartment instead. The particular aggressive cleaning of someone trying to outrun a thought. And at 9 p.m., she sat down at her kitchen table with a glass of water and looked at the wall and understood that the thing she had been managing for 3 months was not manageable anymore. The call came at 9:47. Not Rutherford, not Moss, not Briggs. The number was a Virginia area code, 703, which she recognized as the Northern Virginia government corridor, before the person on the other end said a single word. Nora. A voice she knew, a voice she had not heard in 14 months. Her hand tightened on the phone. "Major Delaney," she said. "I'm a lieutenant colonel now," said the voice. It was warm and controlled and carried about 7 different things in it simultaneously, which was how Claudia Delaney had always spoken. "But that's not why I'm calling. You're calling because Rutherford pulled my file. I'm calling because Rutherford pulled your file and called me directly and asked me to explain why one of the most effective combat medical officers we'd trained in 15 years left the program, scrubbed her records with federal assistance, and went to work as a civilian ER nurse in North Carolina under a modified name." A pause. "I told him the truth, that it was your choice, fully made, fully supported, and that we did not pressure you and we did not want you back if you didn't want to come." "That's the truth," Nora said. "Yes," Delaney said. "It is." Another pause, longer this time, more deliberate. "But then he told me what happened last night, and then he told me what happened this morning. And I want you to know, Nora, I want you to actually hear this, that what they did is not something I'm prepared to let sit." Nora looked at her wall. "You don't have to do anything. I'm aware of that. It's a civilian hospital. It's their process. I knew the risk when I—" "Nora." Delaney said her name the way she had always said it. Not loud, not soft, just exact. "You saved a contractor who was running support for an active classified operation, using a technique from a federal medical training program, after correctly diagnosing a presentation that most emergency physicians would have missed, and they fired you for it before the sun came up." A brief pause. "I need you to tell me if you want me to do something about that." The kitchen was quiet. The rain outside had finally stopped. The silence after rain was a specific kind of silence. The city recalibrating, the streets adjusting, everything wet and still. "What could you do?" Nora asked. Delaney was quiet for a moment. "I could make some calls," she said, "to people who understand what your presence in that room last night actually meant, to people who have standing to ask questions that the hospital's board doesn't get to dismiss." A pause. "And I could do it in a way that puts your name back where it belongs." Nora thought about Daryl Pruitt, Thomas Carver, in the ICU. She thought about the sound of air releasing. She thought about Feldy's face when she picked up the needle, the particular expression of a man who was afraid of the thing he was watching and had decided to be angry instead. She thought about the 3 nurses Pete Okafor had mentioned, the good ones who left. "It's not just me," she said slowly. "No," Delaney agreed. "I don't imagine it is. There are other people in that department who've been pushed out. If you go in looking for what happened to me, you'll find a larger pattern." She paused. Can you work with that?" "I can absolutely work with that," Delaney said. Nora exhaled. It came out longer than she intended. "Then yes," she said. "I'm telling you I want you to do something about it." "All right," Delaney said. Not triumphant, not even particularly satisfied. Just the sound of someone who had been waiting for a particular door to open, and now it had. "Get some sleep, Nora. Tomorrow is going to be a different kind of day." The call ended. Nora sat at the kitchen table for a long time after. The city was quiet outside, and her apartment was quiet inside, and somewhere across Raleigh, in the ICU on the 7th floor of Harmon Valley Medical Center, a man named Thomas Carver was breathing on his own because of what she had done. And Marcus Felda had gone home tonight having signed a termination notice and considered the matter closed. He did not know what was coming. She wasn't sure she did either, entirely. But she knew Claudia Delaney, and she knew the particular tone in Delaney's voice when she said the words, "I could make some calls." And she knew that the thing that had been set in motion was not the kind of thing that stopped when someone asked it to. She went to bed. She did not sleep particularly well. At 3:17 a.m., her phone lit up with a text from a number she didn't have saved. A Virginia 703 number, different from Delaney's. Just 8 words, no punctuation, no context. "Check your hospital's board member list in the morning." She stared at it for a long time in the dark. Then she put the phone face down on the nightstand and lay back and looked at the ceiling and thought about what 8 words sent at 3 in the morning could possibly mean about what someone had already found. She checked the board member list at 6:48 in the morning, standing in her kitchen in yesterday's clothes with coffee she hadn't touched yet, going cold on the counter. Harmon Valley Medical Center's board of directors was publicly listed on the hospital's website. 12 names, the standard mix of physicians, administrators, and community representatives that populated every nonprofit hospital board in the country. She read through them the way she read anything now, which was fast, and with the specific attention to pattern that years of training had made involuntary. She found it on the 9th name, Gerald Foss, board member since 2019, listed as a community representative with a background in regional infrastructure development. She recognized neither the name nor the background. She looked him up in a separate tab. Public records, professional profiles, the surface layer of information that anyone could find. Gerald Foss was a former logistics executive who had pivoted to consulting in 2018. His firm's client list was not public. His professional history before 2015 was sparse in the specific way that professional histories were sparse when the work being done wasn't meant to be public. And his consulting firm was incorporated in Northern Virginia, zip code 2202, Pentagon adjacent. She put down her phone. She picked up her coffee. She stared out the window at the parking lot of her apartment complex, where the overnight rain had left the asphalt dark and reflecting the early sky. Gerald Foss was on his board of the hospital that had just fired her, and someone with a Virginia 703 number had sent her an 8-word text at 3 in the morning pointing her at that board member list, which meant someone had connected those dots before she had and had wanted her to connect them too. She was still working out what it meant when her phone rang. Rutherford. "You saw it," he said when she answered. It wasn't a question. "Foss," she said. "He's been on that board for 4 years. We didn't know until last night. We had no reason to look. Carver's cover was solid, the accident looked like what it looked like, and a civilian hospital wasn't on our radar in terms of operational security." A pause. She could hear something in the background, the ambient sound of a controlled environment, engines possibly, the kind of background that meant he wasn't in a hotel room. "It may still be coincidence." "Do you think it's coincidence?" she asked. He didn't answer for a moment. "No," he said, "but I'm not willing to act on a 4-year-old board membership without more." "What does Delaney think?" "She thinks the same thing I do, and she's already working it from her end." Another pause. "What I need to know from you right now is whether you're willing to come in. Not permanently. We just need a conversation, one that happens in person, in a controlled space, with people who have the clearance to talk about Thomas Carver's actual situation." "Camp Lejeune?" she said. "We're not at Lejeune anymore. We relocated last night." He didn't say where. She didn't ask. "When?" she said. "Today. I can have someone at your apartment in 2 hours." She looked around her kitchen, at the cold coffee, the apartment she'd cleaned as displacement activity, the closet with the boxes she'd now opened. 1 hour, she said. The drive was 90 minutes, which she spent in the back seat of the second black SUV while the compact man from the conference room, who had introduced himself only as Sayers and offered nothing else, drove without conversation and with the specific competence of someone who'd done long surveillance driving and considered small talk a tactical liability. She had brought both boxes from the closet. They were in the cargo area behind her, which she was aware of in the way you were aware of things you'd been avoiding. They went east out of Raleigh, then southeast, into the flat pine country that ran toward the coast. She watched the landscape change through the window. The city falling away, the strip malls thinning, the highway narrowing and the tree line rising on both sides until the road felt less like a road and more like a corridor through something older and less arranged. She thought about Gerald Foss. 4 years on that board, which meant he was there before she arrived, which meant if there was a connection, it predated her, which meant she wasn't the target of anything. She was, at most, a complication, an accident of circumstance, a nurse who happened to recognize a presentation that the situation required go unrecognized, or possibly just a nurse who happened to recognize a presentation and happened to be in the room, and the Foss connection was exactly what Rutherford said it might be, coincidence. She had learned in the places she'd worked that coincidence was real, and that people who stopped believing in it made analytical errors in the other direction. Not everything was connected, but some things were, and the skill was knowing which. She didn't know yet. She was aware she didn't know yet. Sayers pulled off the highway onto a county road, then onto a secondary road with no markings, then through a gate with a guard post that was staffed and waved them through without stopping. The facility beyond the gate was small, a cluster of low buildings set back from a tree line, the kind of facility that didn't announce itself and wasn't meant to. She got out of the SUV. Rutherford was waiting outside the main building, in a jacket against the morning chill, looking like someone who had not slept but who had made peace with that some hours ago. Moss was beside him, in the same posture of alert stillness as yesterday. "Thank you for coming," Rutherford said. "You said in person," she said. Here I am." He almost smiled. "In person, yes." He looked at the boxes she was carrying. "You brought those." "If we're going to have this conversation, we should have it with everything on the table." She held his gaze. "That's what I'd want if our positions were reversed." "It is," he said. He held the door open. The briefing room was small and had no windows, which she found immediately comfortable in the specific way that windowless operational rooms were comfortable to people who'd spent time in them. There was a table, chairs, a screen, and a coffee set up in the corner that she moved toward first, because she hadn't finished the cup she'd abandoned at home. Moss was already at the table with a laptop. The large man with the jaw scar, she learned his name was Harwick, was near the door, not sitting. The fourth team member, a quiet woman named Yu, who Nora hadn't spoken to yet, was at a secondary station with a separate screen. Rutherford came in last and closed the door. "Okay," he said. "Let's start with Carver." What she learned in the next 20 minutes was not the full picture. She understood that, accepted it, didn't push against the edges of what they were willing to tell her. But the shape of it was this. Thomas Carver had been doing support work for a regional intelligence operation with no public profile. The operation had, in the previous 72 hours, run into a problem that had resulted in Carver being exposed to something, a substance, an environmental agent, the specifics of which they were still characterizing, before the secondary trauma of the highway accident. So his collapse in the ER wasn't just the crash, she said. "No," Moss said. "The crash aggravated a process that had already started. The tension Pneumo developed from a combination of blunt trauma and a pre-existing condition that accelerated under the physical stress." "What condition?" Moss looked at Rutherford. Rutherford nodded once. "We think he was exposed to an aerosolized irritant about 4 hours before the accident. Not lethal at the concentration he encountered, but enough to begin inflammatory changes in the pleural tissue. Under normal circumstances, he might have presented with chest tightness and shortness of breath over the following 12 to 24 hours. The crash compressed that timeline significantly." Nora sat with that. So the standard trauma workup, even if Felda had tubed him correctly, would have treated the mechanical injury and not the underlying process. "Yes," Moss said. "And within 6 hours, the underlying process would have become the primary problem. Does his ICU team know?" "They do now," Rutherford said. "We had our medical officer brief the attending at 2 this morning under a classified consultation framework. Carver is on the right treatment protocol as of 3 hours ago." A pause. "Which is also because of something you said." She looked at him. "When Moss reviewed your trauma bay assessment, the specific observations you made, the sequence of reasoning, she identified that you'd noted something in his presentation that wasn't in the paramedic handoff report and wasn't in Felda's documentation, a secondary symptom." "His fingers," Nora said. Moss looked up from the laptop. "Yes. The tremor pattern was wrong for hypovolemic shock. It was too fine, too distal." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "I noticed it when the gurney came in. I didn't say it out loud because I was already getting pushed back on the tracheal deviation. But you noted it." "In my documentation, which I filed before they handed me the termination letter." Moss turned her laptop screen around. It showed Nora's clinical notes from the night before. The time-stamped documentation she'd completed in the break room at 4 a.m. The relevant passage was highlighted. "Bilateral distal tremor, fine motor, inconsistent with presentation stage hemorrhagic shock. Rule out secondary neurological or systemic etiology." "That note," Rutherford said, "is what told us to look for something beyond the crash." The room was quiet for a moment. "You saw it in 4 minutes," Moss said, "without knowing any of the background." "I've seen distal tremor presentations in the field," Nora said. "Chemical exposure mostly. It pattern matches to something specific." She paused. "I couldn't have told you what specifically, just that it was wrong." Harwick, from his position near the door, said something for the first time. His voice was lower than she expected. That's the read that mattered. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the floor, the way people looked when they were saying something they meant and didn't need eye contact to validate it. It's the read that saved him, Rutherford said. Then, now I want to talk about Gerald Foss. Uke pulled up a second screen. On it, Foss's professional timeline, reconstructed. Not the public version, the real version, the kind of timeline that required access to databases. Nora didn't have clearance to know existed. The shape of it was less coincidence than Rutherford had been willing to say on the phone. Foss had worked for a defense logistics contractor from 2009 to 2017. The contractor's name wasn't one she recognized. Its work, as summarized on the screen in front of her, was described as supply chain integration for sensitive material movement, language that covered a very wide range of activities, some of which were not comfortable to contemplate in a windowless room. In 2007, a federal audit had flagged irregularities in the contractor's billing for two specific government programs. The audit had been conducted, a finding had been issued, and the finding had been, she read the word carefully, deferred for further review, which in her experience meant someone with standing had decided not to push it forward. In 2018, Foss resigned and formed his consulting firm in Arlington. In 2019, he joined the board of Harmon Valley Medical Center. What's the connection to Carver's operation? She asked. The material irregularities in 2017 touched on supply chains that overlapped with the program Carver was supporting, Yu said. She spoke with precision, each word placed. It's not direct, it's not clean, but the overlap exists. Did Foss know Carver would be transported to Harmon Valley? We don't know, Rutherford said. The accident routing was EMS discretion based on proximity and trauma center availability. It wasn't predetermined. But if Foss has visibility into who's moving through that hospital, he has 4 years of board membership and access to administrative operations, Nora said. Yes. So even if the routing was random, once Carver was there, someone with a reason to watch for that name could have been watching, Rutherford said. The room absorbed that. She thought about the termination process, the speed of it. Felda presenting to the board at 5:45 a.m., 3 board members available, and convened within an hour of a night shift incident, a termination notice issued before the patient in question had even fully stabilized. That was fast. That was the speed of a process that had been ready to move, not the speed of a process that was improvised. How fast was Felda? She asked. With other staff. Rutherford nodded at Yue, who pulled up a separate document. We requested Harmon Valley's HR records this morning under a federal information request related to a patient security matter. It's a narrow authority, but it covers employee actions connected to a patient under classified status. Felda has filed 6 formal disciplinary actions against nursing staff in the past 14 months, Yu said. 3 resulted in terminations. 2 of those terminations were processed within 48 hours of an incident. The third, 7 hours. 7 hours, Nora said. Yours was 6. She looked at the document on the screen. 3 nurses gone. Quick, clean, efficient. Do any of those 3 nurses have records that suggest they saw something they shouldn't have? Yu looked at Rutherford. We're still pulling the patient records connected to those incident dates, Rutherford said, under the same authority. But yes, one of those termination dates corresponds to a date on which a patient affiliated with a federal contractor was treated in the Harmon Valley Emergency Department. The room went quiet with a particular quality of quiet, the kind that happened when everyone in a room arrived at the same implication simultaneously and was deciding how to say it. Felda, Nora said carefully, may not be acting alone. He may not even know what he's protecting, Rutherford said. That's the part that matters. A board member with a financial or operational interest in certain patients not being closely observed. All he'd need is a chief of emergency medicine who is already predisposed to punish nursing staff for overstepping, and a process that moves fast when he says move. Felda doesn't need to know the reason, she said. He just needs to be the mechanism. Yes. She put down her coffee mug. What do you need from me? What they needed from her was a statement. Detailed, time-stamped, covering every clinical observation she had made from the moment Carver's gurney came through the bay door to the moment she filed her final notes. They needed it in a format that could be entered into a federal proceeding, which meant she needed to review it with a JAG officer, which Rutherford produced from somewhere in the building within 30 minutes. The JAG officer was a woman named Major Tessa Alvarez, 40, with an efficient manner and reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose. She sat across from Nora with a legal pad and a recording device and went through the night in the ER with the same methodical precision that Nora had used to go through the clinical timeline, and Nora found that she respected her for not asking unnecessary questions. The statement took 2 hours. When it was done, Alvarez looked at the recording device and said, "For the record, is there anything you want to add, correct, or clarify?" "One thing," Nora said. "The documentation I filed at Harmon Valley at approximately 4 a.m. this morning, that's in the hospital's system. They may archive or modify it now that I've been terminated. I want to be on record that what I filed is what I told you." "Noted," Alvarez said. "We'll request preservation." "You should request it today." Alvarez pushed her glasses up. "I'll request it in the next hour." After she left, Nora sat alone in the briefing room for 15 minutes. The screens had been turned off. The coffee was gone. She opened one of the boxes she'd brought from home and took out the medical certification packet, federal seal, program classification markings. She couldn't show anyone without clearance verification. Her name in the upper right corner with the designation that hadn't been her designation in 3 years. She put it on the table. She looked at it the way you looked at something you'd told yourself you were done with and were finding out you were not done with. Rutherford came back in without the rest of his team. He saw the packet on the table and didn't say anything about it. He sat down across from her. "How are you doing?" he asked. It came out like he actually wanted to know. "I'm trying to figure out if I made a mistake coming back here," she said. "To the facility?" "To any of it." She gestured at the packet. "I left for reasons. Good ones." She paused. "Or I thought they were good." "Were they?" She looked at him. He had the face of a man who'd asked hard questions of himself enough times that he'd gotten used to the weight of them. She didn't know his history. She hadn't asked, and he hadn't offered. But she recognized the particular weathering. "Yes," she said. "They were good reasons. Things happened that I didn't want to be in the middle of anymore. And I wasn't wrong about that." She pulled the packet toward her. "But I keep ending up in the middle of things anyway." "Because you see what needs doing," he said. "That's a generous reading. It's the accurate one." She was quiet for a moment. "Delaney called last night. She said she was going to make things move." "She's already moving them," Rutherford said. "She had a call with the deputy director's office at 7 this morning. The Federal Patient Security Authority we're using for the HR records is already expanded. We're not just pulling files anymore. We're opening a formal inquiry." "Into FOSS?" "Into the connection between FOSS, FELDA, and the specific pattern of rapid staff terminations." He leaned forward slightly. "Which means Harmon Valley is going to know something is happening, probably by end of business today." "And FELDA?" "Feld will be notified that his personnel decisions are under federal review in connection with a patient security matter." A pause. "He won't know Thomas Carver's real identity. He won't know the classified program. He'll just know that the nurse he fired has a federal inquiry attached to her name now." She thought about that, about what Felda would do with that information, whether he'd understand it or whether he'd be confused by it, or whether, and this was the thing she kept coming back to, he would go to someone for guidance. "If he goes to FOSS," she said slowly. "Then we have movement," Rutherford said. She understood. The inquiry wasn't just for her. It was a test of the circuit. Apply pressure here and see who lights up over there. "You're using me as a signal," she said. He didn't flinch. "The inquiry is legitimate. Your case is legitimate. The federal review is legitimate." He met her eyes. "But yes, we also want to see who calls whom." She sat with that for a moment. She thought about the nurses who'd been terminated before her. She thought about Bet Simmons documenting the clinical outcome in her favor, a quiet act of record-keeping from a woman who ran a clean department and knew the difference between what was right and what was expedient. She thought about Pete Okafor and the crack in his voice when the patient's condition dropped. "Those other nurses," she said, "the ones Felda terminated. We're locating them. They may not know what they saw. They also may not know that what they saw matters. Rutherford said. We'll reach them carefully. She nodded once. Then she opened the second box. Inside it, beneath the folded service records, was the velvet case. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands, and put it back without opening it. Not yet. She was given a room in the facility, small, functional, with a bed and a bathroom and a window overlooking a section of tree line. She was told she was not obligated to stay, that she could leave and go back to her apartment, and they would keep her informed by phone. She stayed. She told herself it was practical. The drive was 90 minutes, and she didn't know how the day was going to move. But the truth was something less organized than practical. The truth was that after 3 months of being small and contained and careful, something had shifted when she walked into conference room B and found 4 people who already knew the word captain and used it like it was still applicable. She sat on the bed in the small room and called her mother. Her mother was a retired school teacher in Boise who had never asked about the 3-year gap and had never pushed on the reasons Nora had settled in North Carolina specifically, and had made a quiet life out of understanding that her daughter would tell her things when she was ready to tell them. Hi, Mom. Hi, sweetheart. You sound tired. I'm fine. I just wanted to hear your voice. A small pause, the comfortable kind. Are you eating? Yes. Are you sleeping? Not great, but I'm working on it. Okay. Her mother had the wisdom to leave it there. Call me when you can talk properly. I will. She paused. I love you. I love you too, Nora. She hung up and lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and let herself feel tired for about 4 minutes. Then Moss knocked on her door. Felda just called Harmon Valley's legal team, Moss said. She was in the doorway, laptop in hand, with the expression of someone reading from a screen they wanted to put down. Within 2 hours of the federal notification. That's fast, Nora said. It is. Moss came into the room, turned the laptop screen toward her. The legal team's call was routed through the board chairman's office. Standard escalation, except the board chairman's office then placed a call to Gerald Foss's consulting firm in Arlington, within 40 minutes of receiving the federal inquiry notification. Nora sat up. 40 minutes. 41. That's not standard escalation. No, Moss said. It's not. She closed the laptop. Rutherford knows, Delaney knows, the inquiry just got larger. A pause. A lot larger. Nora stood up from the bed. She was fully awake now in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the particular clarity that arrived when something you'd suspected became confirmed. Where's Rutherford? She said. Main building. He's on a call with Delaney and 2 people from the deputy director's office. Moss held her gaze. Nora, this isn't just about the hospital anymore. If Foss's firm has active connections to the supply chain problem from 2017, and if there are people in that network who had any interest in Carver's condition, what about Carver? Nora said. Her voice came out flat and urgent at the same time. He's still in the ICU. He's in a civilian hospital where Gerald Foss sits on the board. Moss was already moving toward the door. Rutherford is requesting a transfer. Requesting. She was right behind Moss. How long does a request take? They need a medical clearance for transport. Carver has to be stable enough to move. When did they last check his status? Moss didn't answer immediately, and the half-second of hesitation was its own answer. When? Nora said. 2 hours ago he was stable, Moss said. But that was before the inquiry notification went out, before Foss was contacted. She pushed through the door into the corridor. We have someone watching the ICU floor remotely, but it's limited. Nora's phone was already in her hand. She pulled up the number Okafor had given her 3 months ago during a night shift when she'd asked, casually, if she could reach him for a clinical question. She'd never used it. She'd stored it anyway. She called. He picked up on the 3rd ring, and she could hear hospital background immediately. The particular layered sound of a medical floor mid-shift. Pete, she said, it's Nora Voss. I need you to listen to me carefully. A brief silence. Nora, hey, I heard about, are you? I'm fine. Pete, the patient from last night, the highway accident, the tension pneumo. What unit is he in? ICU 7. Why? I need you to go up there right now, and I need you to stay there until I tell you it's okay to leave. What? A pause. Nora, I'm in the middle of a shift. I can't just… Pete. She stopped walking. Moss was looking at her from 3 steps ahead. Something is happening that I can't fully explain to you right now, but that patient is at risk and he needs eyes on him from someone I trust. Can you do that? A longer silence. She could hear him breathing, making calculations she couldn't see. What kind of risk? He asked. I don't know yet. That's the honest answer, but I need someone there. Another silence, then, I'll get someone to cover my patients. I'm going now. Don't tell anyone why you're going. Understood. Pete. She hesitated. If anything changes with his condition, if anyone outside his care team approaches that room, I'll call you, he said. The call ended. She looked at Moss, who was already on her own phone. They were both standing in the corridor of a facility in the middle of pine forest in eastern North Carolina and somewhere 90 minutes away. Thomas Carver was in an ICU bed in a hospital where the board had just called a man who had very specific reasons to want that patient to not survive long enough to be transferred. Rutherford came out of a room at the end of the corridor, phone still at his ear, and he saw their faces and ended his call. Tell me, he said. We need the transfer authorization faster than standard, Moss said. Nora put eyes on the ICU. He looked at Nora. Who? A resident I trust. He's there now. Rutherford looked at her for 1 second, not doubting, just measuring. Then he was back on his phone, talking to someone in the clipped cadence of a request that was not going to be refused. Nora's phone rang. Okafor. 40 seconds after she'd hung up with him. She answered. I'm at the ICU, he said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Nora, there's a man here who's not on the care team. He came in right before me. He's at the nursing station and he's showing credentials to the charge nurse. And what does he look like? White male, 50s, business clothes. He's got an ID badge, but it's not a Harmon Valley badge. A pause. Nora, he's asking about the patient's transfer status. The corridor went very cold. Pete, she said, keeping her voice flat and even with the same effort she'd used in the trauma bay. Don't approach him. Don't let him know you're watching. But don't let him get to that room alone. He's moving, Okafor said. He's going toward... The call cut out. She called back immediately, straight to voicemail. She looked at Rutherford, who was already off his phone and reading her face. My contact in the ICU, she said. The call dropped. He was saying someone was moving toward Carver's room. Rutherford turned to Harwick. One word. Go. Harwick was already moving toward the facility exit. We have a vehicle 4 minutes from the hospital, Rutherford said, pulling his phone back up. Harwick will coordinate from the road. He looked at Nora. Does your contact know to physically block access? He's a second-year resident, she said. He knows to stay present. That's all I asked. That may be enough. Rutherford was already dialing. If someone is approaching that room with false credentials, the fact that there's a physician physically standing at the bedside changes the calculus for anyone who needs the action to look accidental. She understood that. She also understood that Pete Okafor was 26 years old and had gone up to a floor she'd sent him to without knowing exactly what she was sending him into, and that understanding sat in her chest with a specific weight. Her phone rang. Different number, 9119, Raleigh prefix she didn't have saved. She answered. Ms. Voss? A woman's voice, controlled and professional, with an edge of something underneath it. This is Dr. Renata Osei. I'm the ICU attending on 7. I have a resident here who says he's acting on your instruction. He is, Nora said. How is the patient? A brief pause. Stable. We've been briefed this morning on his actual medical situation, and he's on the appropriate protocol. Another pause. There was a man here approximately 4 minutes ago with administrative credentials. He told my nursing staff he needed to review the patient's insurance documentation. What happened? Dr. Okafor asked him to verify his credentials through the main administrative system. The man declined and left. Nora let out a breath that was mostly relief and partly something colder, because a man who left when credentials were questioned wasn't someone who'd made a mistake. He was someone who'd made a calculation. Dr. Osei, she said, can you restrict access to that room to care team only? I've already done it. The attending's voice had a quality Nora recognized, the specific controlled anger of a physician who had just found out her unit had been treated as accessible for reasons that had nothing to do with patient care. I've also called our security chief and we're pulling the badge access log for the floor. I don't know what's happening, Ms. Voss, but I know that man wasn't here for insurance paperwork. No, Nora said. He wasn't. Someone will want to explain this to me properly. They will, Nora said. Today. She ended the call and told Rutherford in 20 seconds flat. He absorbed it, processed it, and made 2 calls in rapid sequence, one to Harwick, redirecting him, and one to a number she didn't hear him name. Badge access log, he said to her after the second call. If he badged onto that floor, we'll have his credentials on record within the hour. If he used real credentials, she said. If he used false ones, they still leave a digital footprint. He looked at her steadily. Either way, we're finding him. The next 4 hours moved in a way she had experienced before. Not in hospitals, but in operational environments, where things happened in bursts and then plateaued into waiting, and the waiting was its own kind of work because you had to stay sharp through it. She had learned to treat the plateau like an active state, to keep thinking, to not let the pause become complacency. She went back to the briefing room and sat with Yue and went through the timeline they were building, Voss's history, Felda's disciplinary record, the overlapping dates, the supply chain audit from 2017, the specific gap in documentation around 2 of the 3 contractor programs that Carver's operation had been designed to quietly investigate. Because that was the thing that had been clarified by noon in a direct call between Rutherford and Delaney with Nora present. Thomas Carver had not been doing passive logistics support. He had been documenting irregularities. He was, in the flattest possible terms, gathering evidence. How much did he have? Nora asked. Enough, Delaney's voice said from the speaker on the conference table. Encrypted, backed up off-site, already partially transmitted to us before the accident. But the physical drive he was carrying, it wasn't in the vehicle when EMS arrived. The room absorbed that. Someone got to the crash site before it was secured, Nora said. The response timeline is being reviewed, Delaney said. There was a 14-minute gap between the accident call and the first emergency response arrival. That's long for that stretch of I-40. 14 minutes. Long enough for someone monitoring Carver's movements to reach a crash site, extract a drive, and be gone before the ambulances arrived. And Carver didn't know his cover was blown, Rutherford said. It wasn't a question. We don't think so, Delaney said, which means whoever did this has been watching the operation for long enough to know his cover identity, his vehicle, and his route. And they still needed him to not walk out of that hospital. The reason Nora had been fired in under 6 hours was not punitive. It was functional. Get the nurse who saw too much out of the building before she could document anything further, before she could talk to the patient, before she became a problem. She had been fired because she was in the way. The thought arrived cleanly and without drama, and she sat with it for a moment and then set it aside because the more useful thing was what came next. The man who came to the ICU, she said. He left when Pete asked him to verify credentials. That means he didn't want to be on record there, which means he's cautious, Yue said, not panicked. He made a decision and reversed it. That's discipline. Which means he'll try again differently, Nora said, or someone else will. Rutherford looked at her. Transfer is authorized. Medical clearance came through 11 minutes ago. Carver moves at 1600 hours. 4 p.m., 3 hours from now. Does Voss know? She asked. He knows an inquiry is open. He doesn't know about the transfer. Rutherford paused. We want to see if he finds out. At 2:15, the badge access log from ICU 7 came back. You pulled it up on screen and worked through it with the focused efficiency of someone who'd done this kind of document analysis before. The man who had presented at the nursing station had badged onto the floor using a visitor credential registered to the name of a hospital vendor, a medical supply company with a contract with Harmon Valley. The vendor credential was real. The company existed. But the man who had used it was not an employee of that company. His face, captured on the ICU floor camera at the nursing station, was run through the identification system that Rutherford's team had access to. The result came back in 19 minutes. His name was Dennis Varick. He was 47, with a background in private security consulting and a professional history that connected, through 2 intermediary firms, to the same defense logistics contractor that Gerald Voss had worked for until 2017. There it is, Moss said from across the table. It was not said with satisfaction exactly. It was said the way people said things when a structure they'd suspected revealed itself as real and load-bearing, and you understood that the structure was worse than the suspicion. Rutherford made a call. The call was short. When he ended it, he said, "Varick is being located. He's still in Raleigh." A pause. FBI field office is now involved. This is no longer just a federal patient security matter. What is it now? Nora asked. Obstruction of a federal investigation, at minimum. Possibly more, depending on what Varick's presence at that room was intended to accomplish. His jaw was set. And we're going to find out exactly what it was intended to accomplish. She nodded. She was thinking about the three nurses, the ones who had left before her. Whether any of them had been in a room with a patient who was connected to this, who had noticed something in the clinical presentation, who had been moved out of the department with the same 6-hour efficiency. She pulled up the notes she'd made earlier from the HR records review and looked at the dates again. The second termination, a nurse named Gloria Reyes, 14 months ago, had occurred on a date she now cross-referenced against the federal contractor patient record you had identified. Same day, same ER shift. You, she said. Can you find Gloria Reyes? Yue looked at the name, cross-referenced, and had an address and phone number inside 2 minutes in a way that Nora did not ask about. I'll try to reach her, Yue said. I'll try, Nora said. She'll be more likely to talk to another nurse. Yue looked at Rutherford. He nodded. Nora called. The phone rang 6 times and went to voicemail. A generic recorded message, no name. She left a careful message. Her name, a brief and deliberately vague description of why she was calling, a callback number. She put the phone down and looked at the table and thought about a woman who had probably been fired on a Tuesday morning, same as she had been, walked out with a box of belongings, same as she had then spent 14 months not knowing that what she'd seen meant something. At 3:10 p.m., Marcus Feldy walked into the office of Harmon Valley's CEO and sat down without being invited. She found out about it from Okafor, who heard about it from the clinical coordinator on Administrative Row, who had been walking past the CEO's office when she heard raised voices. Okafor called her at 3:14. He's losing it, he said, his voice low. Like, publicly, in the CEO's office. Someone told him federal investigators pulled the HR files and he's... A pause. He's saying it's retaliatory. That the nurse, you, had a personal problem with him and fabricated the clinical scenario. She was quiet for a moment. What's the CEO saying? From what Petra heard at the door, not much. He's letting Felda talk. Another pause. Nora, the head of HR, just came out of her office and walked very fast toward legal, and the board liaison just got a call that made her go pale. The circuit was lighting up exactly as Rutherford had said it would. She imagined the calls going outward from Felda's performance in the CEO's office, to the board, to Foss's consulting firm in Arlington, the chain of people who needed to know that the thing they'd assumed was handled was very much not handled. Pete, she said, stay in the building, don't go to Administrative Row, and... She stopped. How are you doing? A pause that was smaller than the ones before it. Honestly, I feel like I've been awake for a week and nothing makes sense. It will make sense, she said. Soon. You promise? She almost said yes. I'll explain it when I can. She ended the call and told Rutherford what was happening. He looked at the clock on the wall. 40 minutes to transfer. He made another call, this one to the FBI field office, which had formally taken point on the Varick situation, and which was now, she gathered from his end of the conversation, also very interested in Marcus Feldy's public deterioration in the CEO's office. They want to talk to Felda today, Rutherford said when he ended the call, before he lawyers up. Will he? He doesn't know yet that he needs to. Rutherford set down the phone. He thinks this is about you. He thinks a disgruntled nurse filed a federal complaint and it's a process he can talk his way through. A pause. He doesn't know about Carver. He doesn't know about Foss. He doesn't know we have Varick on camera in the ICU with falsified vendor credentials. He's going to be very surprised, she said. Yes, Rutherford said. It was not said with satisfaction either. It was said the way you said something when the outcome was right, but the machinery that had produced it was ugly, and you hadn't forgotten that. At 3:58, Thomas Carver was moved. Nora was not there for it. She was still at the facility, 90 minutes away. But Moss had aligned to the transfer team and relayed the steps in real time. Carver was moved under a different name on a medical transport with a federal escort and without going through standard discharge paperwork, which Harmon Valley's administrative staff was still processing when the bed on ICU 7 was already empty. At 4:23, Gloria Reyes called back. Nora answered on the first ring. The woman on the other end of the call had a voice that sounded like someone who had decided to be careful before she even said hello. "You said your name was Nora Voss," she said, "and that you worked at Harmon Valley." "I did," Nora said. "Until yesterday." A pause. "Felda?" "Yes." Another pause, longer. "I worked there for 3 years," Gloria Reyes said. "I was terminated in January last year. They said I violated medication protocol on a patient. I didn't." She said it flatly, without drama, the way you said something you'd been saying only to yourself for 14 months. "I documented what I saw and filed my notes, and the next morning I was gone." "What did you see?" Nora asked. "A patient. Highway accident, which seems to be a pattern now that I think about it." Her voice sharpened. "His vitals were inconsistent, not with the injury they presented, with something else. I flagged it. The attending told me to rerun the triage and not add clinical observations that weren't in scope." "Did you know who the patient was?" "No." "Did anyone come to the hospital after? Anyone military or federal or—" "No," Gloria said. "Nobody came. I just lost my job and couldn't get a reference from the department and spent 6 months finding a position at a clinic in Greensboro." A pause. "Why are you asking me this?" Nora looked at the door of the briefing room, at Rutherford across the table, at the timeline on the screen. "Because what you saw mattered," she said, "and I want you to know that." Gloria was quiet for a moment. "Is something happening?" "Yes," Nora said, "and I think you're going to want to give a statement to a federal investigator." The silence that followed was not reluctance. It was the specific quality of silence that happened when someone had been waiting 14 months for a reason that made sense of a thing that had made no sense, and the reason had finally arrived. "Yes," Gloria said. "I'll give a statement." At 5:40 p.m., Dennis Varick was located at a Hampton Inn 11 minutes from Harmon Valley Medical Center. Nora was not there for that either. She was in the facility's small kitchen, eating a sandwich she'd made because Moss had appeared in the doorway of the briefing room an hour earlier and said simply, "You need to eat something," and Nora had not had the energy to argue. The sandwich was turkey on wheat, slightly stale, and she ate it mechanically while Moss sat across from her and drank coffee, and neither of them said much. "How did you end up doing this?" Nora asked after a while. Moss considered the question. "I was a flight surgeon," she said. "Forward bases, mostly. I was good at it, and I liked it, and then something happened that changed what I thought I was doing it for." A pause. "Rutherford recruited me afterward. The work made sense to me. Protecting people whose exposure is operational rather than direct." "You miss the clinical work?" "Sometimes." She held her coffee mug. "Do you miss it, the field work?" Nora looked at her sandwich. "I didn't know I did until 2 days ago," she said. Moss nodded, like that answer was one she recognized. Her phone lit up. She read it and looked at Nora. "Varick is in custody. FBI took him at 1740. Nora set down the sandwich. "What's the charge?" "For now, presenting falsified credentials at a federal patient security site and obstruction. They're interviewing him." Moss put her phone down. "He's a cautious man. He may not talk tonight." "He doesn't have to," Nora said. "The credential trail connects him to Foss. The Foss connection connects to the supply chain audit. Carver's documentation connects the audit to the financial irregularities. And Felda—" She stopped. "Feld is the weakest link," Moss said. "He doesn't know he's a link," Nora said. "He thinks he's the person who fired an insubordinate nurse." Moss looked at her evenly. "When he finds out what he's been doing, what he's been used for, that's going to be a significant moment." "Yes," Nora said. "How do you feel about that?" Nora thought about it honestly. She thought about standing in a trauma bay at midnight doing something she'd been trained to do, correctly, and watching a man's face go from dismissal to fury, not because she was wrong, but because she had been right without his permission. She thought about the termination letter on hospital letterhead and the fluorescent light in the break room and the badge she'd placed on Colin's desk at 7 in the morning. She thought about Gloria Reyes spending 14 months in Greensboro with a gap in her professional record and no explanation for it. "I don't feel good about it," she said. "I just feel like it needs to happen." Moss looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way she nodded when something was accurate enough that she didn't need to add to it. Rutherford came into the kitchen. He looked tired in a way that was becoming visible now that the high operational phase had passed into the slower grind of legal and federal process. He had a phone in each hand, and he put them both on the table. Felda was interviewed by the FBI at Harmon Valley at 17:15, he said. He agreed to speak without counsel, he stopped, which is either very confident or very uninformed. "What did he say?" Nora asked. "He explained his decision to terminate you as a straightforward protocol enforcement action. He was articulate about it. He had documentation ready." Rutherford sat down. Then they asked him about Gloria Reyes and about a third nurse named Victor Holt, terminated 11 months ago, and his articulation got considerably less smooth. Did he know he was connected to Foss? He says he's never spoken to Foss directly, that the board and the clinical staff operate independently. A pause. That may even be true. If Foss was operating through the board chairman, through the chairman's communications with hospital administration, through administrative pressure on the clinical hierarchy, Felda may have been responding to institutional culture rather than direct instruction. Which makes him easier to prosecute, Moss said, or harder. Harder for the obstruction charges. Easier for the professional misconduct case. Rutherford looked at Nora. The federal patient security violation stands regardless of whether Felda knew what he was protecting. He created a pattern of suppressing clinical observations in a context that materially affected a federal patient's care. 3 nurses, Nora said, over 14 months. 3 nurses over 14 months, Rutherford confirmed. And the documentation from each incident, including your notes from 2 nights ago, creates a pattern that the North Carolina Medical Board is now reviewing. He paused. Delaney's office sent the consolidated file to the medical board at 4 p.m. Nora was quiet. The thing she had not let herself think about directly was beginning to have edges she could see. The shape of what was coming for Marcus Felda was becoming distinct. Not just a federal inquiry, not just an uncomfortable interview, but the particular public machinery of institutional accountability, when it finally engaged with someone who had built a career on the assumption that junior staff had no standing to challenge him. It was not going to be fast. These things were never fast. But it was moving. "Foss?" she asked. His consulting firm's office in Arlington received a visitor at 1800 hours, Rutherford said. 2 agents from the Financial Crimes Division. They presented a document request related to the 2017 audit and its connection to the current obstruction investigation. A pause. His attorney arrived 17 minutes later, which tells you something about how prepared they were for this. He knew it was coming, Nora said. He knew something was coming when the inquiry notification went out this morning. He spent the day making calls. Rutherford's expression didn't change much, but something in it settled into a quality she recognized as the specific satisfaction of a man who had watched someone make exactly the mistake he'd been counting on them to make. Every one of those calls was logged. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the tree line was going dark at the edges, the light dropping in the way it did in late March, earlier than you expected, the days not yet long enough to match the warmth. She could see the first stars beginning to show above the pines. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text from a number she now recognized as Delaney's. Board member Foss submitted resignation from Harmon Valley Board as of 1845. Legal counsel advising no further comment. She showed it to Rutherford. He read it. He put the phone back on the table. "He thinks a resignation changes his exposure," Moss said. "It doesn't," Rutherford said. "It just confirms he understood he had exposure." Nora looked at the text for another moment. Then she put the phone face down on the table and looked at the 2 of them. Rutherford tired and precise, Moss watchful and still. And she thought about what the next days would look like. The federal process grinding forward. The medical board review. The FBI working Varick. Working the document request. Working the call logs that Foss had obligingly filled with evidence all afternoon. She thought about Feldy sitting in an interview room at Harmon Valley, getting articulate about protocol, not knowing yet what was underneath the question. She thought about a man named Thomas Carver in a secure medical facility somewhere, on the right treatment protocol for a condition that would have killed him if she had waited for permission. And then she thought about the thing Rutherford had not said yet, the thing that had been underneath the whole day and the way that certain things sat underneath a clinical presentation, present, structural, waiting to become the main problem. "There's something you're not telling me," she said. Rutherford looked at her. "You've been managing the sequencing of this all day," she said. "What you told me when, what got activated in what order. You're good at it. But there's something you held back." She met his eyes. "I'm not a liability you need to manage. I'm the person who started this. Tell me what it is." A long pause. Moss looked at the table. "Carver wasn't working alone," Rutherford said finally. "He had a contact inside the hospital, someone who had been helping him track the pattern of unusual patient admissions, the contractor-affiliated cases, the ones that got quiet treatment and then disappeared from standard documentation." She was very still. "Who?" Rutherford looked at her steadily. "Someone who has been at Harmon Valley for 11 years, he said. "Someone who is not in the clinical hierarchy. Someone who saw what was happening to the nursing staff and kept records of it, names, dates, termination reasons, clinical incident reports, and who passed some of those records to Carver 3 weeks ago." She went through the list of people she'd met at Harmon Valley in 3 months. Administration, security, the front desk, the supply chain staff. "Who?" she said again. And Rutherford said a name she knew, not from the clinical floor, from the front desk, first shift. The person who had taken her badge on the morning she was fired and said, "I'm sorry, Ms. Voss," with an expression that said something more than routine sympathy. "Colin," she said. "Colin Marsh," Rutherford said. "Security desk, 11 years. He's been watching this longer than anyone." The kitchen was quiet. "Is he safe?" she asked. "He was," Rutherford said, and the past tense landed in the room like something breaking. "His apartment was entered sometime this afternoon. He's not there. His phone is going to voicemail." Rutherford was already on his phone before the word finished landing in the room. Nora was on hers 4 seconds later, pulling up the number Colin had called her from, the 919 number she'd stored after he'd rung her once, 3 weeks into her employment, to tell her she'd left her badge in the break room and security needed it back before end of shift. She'd saved it without thinking. She called it now without thinking either, straight to voicemail. His voice on the recording was young and professional and gave nothing. "You've reached Colin Marsh, please leave a message." She hung up and looked at Rutherford, who was talking fast and low into his phone, and then at Moss, who was already pulling up something on her laptop with the focused urgency of someone running a search they needed to produce results immediately. "How long has his apartment been unaccounted for?" Nora asked. Moss looked up. "We flagged it at 1750 when we couldn't reach him to confirm the Varick identification. Someone went to his address at 1830 and found the door unlocked. Personal effects inside. Vehicle still in the lot." "So he didn't leave voluntarily," Nora said. "Almost certainly not." Moss turned the laptop. "He lives in an apartment complex on the south side, about 2 miles from the hospital. Complex has exterior cameras. We requested footage." "Does he know Varick was taken?" Nora asked. "Did he know this was moving today?" "We don't know how much Carver told him," Rutherford said, lowering his phone. Their communication was through a secure channel, but if Carver was compromised before the accident, if Foss's network had visibility into what Carver was documenting, they may have known about Colin's involvement for days. Nora stood up from the kitchen table. "He's 11 years at that hospital," she said. "He's been watching this since before any of us were looking. He kept records. He passed them to Carver, and now Carver is safe and Colin is missing." She looked at Rutherford. "They didn't go after Carver in the ICU to protect the financial fraud. They went after him because he had the documentation. If the documentation is already transmitted, the only remaining exposure is the witnesses." Rutherford looked at her with an expression that said she had just said the thing he'd already concluded and hadn't wanted to say first. "Yes." "Then Colin is a witness." "Yes." "Find him," she said. It came out flat and certain, not a request, the way she'd said tension pneumo in the trauma bay 2 nights ago, and Rutherford heard it the same way Felda had heard it, like something that was going to happen regardless of whether anyone gave permission. "We're finding him," he said. The next 2 hours were the hardest kind of operational waiting, the kind where things were moving and you couldn't see them moving. where other people were doing the work, and your role was to stay available and not unravel. She was not good at it. She had never been good at it. She went to the small room they'd given her, and she changed into the spare clothes she'd had the presence of mind to pack that morning. A lifetime ago, it felt like, when she'd pulled the boxes off the closet shelf and made a decision she hadn't fully named yet. She laced up her running shoes and then sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them and understood she was not going anywhere. At 8:47, Moss knocked. The look on her face when Nora opened the door was not the look of bad news. It was the look of someone who had been holding a specific kind of tension for 2 hours and was releasing it. "He's at a diner," Moss said. 12 minutes from his apartment. He's been there since approximately 1600 hours. Nora exhaled. He ran. He ran smart, left his phone in the apartment, probably knew it was trackable, took cash, went somewhere public with multiple exits, and kept ordering coffee. Moss almost smiled. 11 years of watching, he knew the protocol. Is he safe? 2 agents are with him now. He's talking. A pause. He's been talking for the last 40 minutes, apparently. The agent says he has a notebook. A physical notebook. In a world where everything left a digital trail that could be accessed, intercepted, erased, a man who had spent 11 years watching things happen at a security desk had kept a physical notebook. Nora sat back down on the bed and put her face in her hands for a moment. Not crying, she was too tired for that and too wired. Just the specific gesture of someone who needed 10 seconds of dark and quiet to process relief. Then she stood up and went back to the briefing room. But Colin Marsh's notebook contained 4 years of entries, dates, names, room numbers, staff members terminated, patients who arrived under unusual circumstances and left without standard discharge procedures. Board communications he'd overheard from his position at the security desk, which was, as anyone who had ever worked a hospital security desk could have told you, one of the single best intelligence positions in any large institution, because everyone who moved through a building in an official capacity checked in at security and said more than they realized while doing it. He had not known what he was documenting, not precisely. He had known that something was wrong. He had the specific knowledge of someone who had watched an institution long enough to understand its rhythms and had noticed, 3 years ago, that the rhythm had changed, that certain patients were handled differently, that certain staff actions were met with consequences that didn't match the stated reason, that certain people moved through the building with credentials that didn't quite fit the access they were granted. He had started writing it down because he didn't know what else to do with it. He had met Thomas Carver 6 weeks ago, not as a contractor with a cover identity, but as a man who had come to the hospital for a routine consultation and had, in the process of checking in at the security desk, asked Colin a question about the hospital's administrative structure that was slightly too specific to be casual. Colin had looked at him for a long moment and then said very quietly, "I have a notebook you might want to see." Rutherford told her this at 9:15, standing in the briefing room with the kind of bone tiredness that was starting to show through his operational composure. "He's been sitting on this for 4 years," he said. "He didn't know who to bring it to. He didn't trust the hospital administration. He didn't know if it was enough for law enforcement. He just kept writing." "Is it enough?" she asked. "The notebook, combined with Carver's documentation, the call logs from today, the Varick identification, and the 3 nursing termination records." "Yes," Rutherford said. "It's enough. Delaney's team spent the last 2 hours with the federal prosecutor's office. The financial crimes case against Foss is moving to formal charges." He looked at her. "And the case against Felda, the medical board referral, and the federal obstruction charge related to the patient security violations is fully documented." She sat down. She wasn't sure her legs were interested in continuing to hold her up. "Felda doesn't know yet," Rutherford said. "He left the hospital at 1900 hours. He was told the FBI interview was preliminary. He went home." She thought about Marcus Felda going home on a Thursday evening, making dinner maybe, or not making dinner, sitting in whatever his house looked like, believing that the thing he'd done 2 days ago was resolved. A nurse terminated, a process followed, an incident closed. Going through the motions of a normal evening with the particular confidence of someone who had operated for 19 years in an environment where his authority was unchallenged and his decisions were permanent. She thought about the morning that was coming for him. "When?" she asked. "The medical board notification goes out at 8 a.m. Friday," Rutherford said. The federal obstruction charge follows at 9. His legal team will be contacted simultaneously. And Foss? Federal arrest warrant is being processed tonight. He'll be taken tomorrow morning. Rutherford put his phone on the table. His attorney has been in contact with the prosecutor's office since 1900. He knows it's coming. He just doesn't know the full scope of what Carver documented. She looked at the table. She thought about the supply chain irregularities from 2017, the deferred audit, the years of a structure that had been built to move certain things without scrutiny and had evolved over time into something that required the active suppression of anyone who looked too closely. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, more like an arrangement, the kind of arrangement that started as financial convenience and accumulated necessity until it was easier to remove a nurse than to let her clinical observation become part of a record. She thought about Gloria Reyes in Greensboro, about Victor Holt, the third terminated nurse, whom Yua had located that afternoon working at a physical therapy clinic in Durham, who had given a statement over the phone with the flat, careful voice of someone who had long since processed his anger into something dull and just wanted it to be on record. 3 nurses, 4 years of entries in a security guard's notebook, a contractor who'd been gathering evidence quietly until a highway accident had accelerated every timeline simultaneously, and a woman who had come to work a night shift and picked up a needle because a man was dying and she knew how to stop it. "What happens to Colin?" she asked. "He's being moved to protective custody tonight as a material witness. His cooperation is formal now." Rutherford looked at her. "He's going to be all right." She nodded. "You should sleep," he said. "Probably," she said, and didn't move. She slept badly and woke at 5:30 to the sound of rain again, the same early spring indecision as 2 mornings ago, and lay in the narrow bed in the facility room and looked at the ceiling and thought about the boxes on the floor. The velvet case was still inside the second one. She hadn't opened it since Portland, where she had packed it the way you packed something you weren't done with but weren't ready to carry yet. She got up and took it out and sat on the edge of the bed with it in her hands. It was small and heavier than it looked, which was always the way with these things. She opened it. Inside, on a bed of worn fabric, a service medal and a citation folded beneath it, the paper soft from age and handling. She had read the citation so many times in the year after she'd received it that she had stopped being able to see the words separately from the event they described. The two things fused into one fixed point in her memory. She didn't read it now. She just held the case and looked at it and let herself understand something she had been in the process of understanding for the past 3 days. She had not left the work because she was done with it. She had left because she needed to not be in it for a while. And there was a difference between those two things that she had been calling the same thing for 3 years, and the difference mattered. She put the case on the nightstand. She got dressed. She went to find coffee. At 8:03 a.m. on Friday, Marcus Felder received a notification from the North Carolina Medical Board that his clinical conduct was under formal review, that a suspension of his emergency medicine privileges was effective immediately pending the outcome of the investigation, and that he was required to respond in writing within 10 business days. At 9:11 a.m., an FBI agent knocked on his front door. Nora was not there. She was in the facility's briefing room, on a call with Delaney, when Moss handed her a phone showing the update in a text chain she didn't have direct access to. She read it. She handed the phone back. "How is he taking it?" she asked Moss. "He opened the door," Moss said, and when the agent introduced himself, Feldy apparently said, and I'm quoting from the field report, "This is about that nurse." A pause. He still doesn't understand the scale of it. She thought about that. About the particular tunnel vision of a man who had spent 19 years being the most important person in any room he entered, looking at an FBI agent on his doorstep and immediately locating himself as the protagonist of an injustice rather than a contributor to one. She thought about how long that understanding was going to take to arrive, and whether it ever fully would. "He'll understand when the charges are read," she said. "Yes," Moss said. "He will." At 9:40, Gerald Foss was arrested at his home in McLean, Virginia, by 2 agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and 1 from the Federal Intelligence Oversight Office, whose specific designation Nora did not hear clearly and did not ask to have repeated. The charges, as relayed to her by Delaney's office: obstruction of a federal investigation, conspiracy to suppress material evidence in a classified program review, and 3 counts related to the 2017 supply chain irregularities that the deferred audit had never resolved. His attorney issued a statement within the hour. His client denied all charges and looked forward to clearing his name through the proper legal process. The statement used the word meritless twice. Nora read it once on Yu's screen and did not read it again. Dennis Varick, who had spent the night in federal custody, began talking at 6 a.m. Friday in the way that people talked when they had spent the night doing the math and decided cooperation was the better arithmetic. He confirmed the connection between Foss's consulting firm and the operation to monitor Carver's movements. He confirmed that his visit to the ICU had been instructed, not improvised. He did not know, he said, what the intended outcome was. He had been told to assess the patient's transfer status and report back. He said this with the careful diction of someone who had decided how much to say and had said exactly that amount and not one word more. It was enough. Rutherford told her at 10:15, and she sat in the briefing room with that information for a while, turning it over, looking at the shape of it. The structure had taken 4 years to build and less than 48 hours to begin collapsing, which was how these things always went, slowly and then suddenly, the way a bank eroded, grain by grain, and then all at once. At 11 a.m., she asked Rutherford to take her back to Raleigh. He looked at her for a moment. "We still have some process today." "I know," she said. "I'll be available by phone, but I need to go back." He didn't ask why. He just nodded and said he'd have Sayers drive her. In the car, she called her mother. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hi, Mom." She looked out the window at the pine corridor falling away behind them, the highway opening up ahead. "I have some things to tell you." A pause. The comfortable kind, but with a tension behind it. "Okay," her mother said. "I'm listening." She didn't tell her everything. She told her enough, that she'd been working at a hospital and something had happened, and she'd done the thing she knew how to do and lost her job over it, and that it was being sorted out, and that she was okay. She left out the classified portions and the arrest and the federal proceedings, and she left out Colin Marsh's notebook and what it had cost a quiet man to keep it for 4 years. But she told her mother the true shape of it, and her mother listened without interrupting, which was a skill she had always had, and when Nora finished, she said, "Are you coming home?" Nora thought about the apartment 20 minutes from the hospital she no longer worked at, the spare clothes in a bag, the boxes on the facility room floor. "Not yet," she said. "But soon, I think, for a visit." "Good," her mother said. "You can sleep in your old room." She almost laughed. "It's a twin bed, Mom. You managed for 18 years. She did laugh then, quietly, briefly, the kind that surprised you by arriving. "I'll call you when I know more," she said. "I know you will," her mother said. "Take care of yourself, Nora." Well, she went to the hospital. Not to go inside. She didn't work there. Her badge was on Colin's desk. The physical fact of that remained unchanged. She parked in the visitor lot, the same spot she'd sat in 2 mornings ago with a cardboard box in the passenger seat, and she looked at the building. It looked the same. It always looked the same from the outside. 12 floors, emergency department on the south side, ambulance bay lit and active because emergencies did not observe the proceedings of the week that had just happened any more than they observed business hours. Pete Okafor called while she was sitting there. "The department it's very strange today," he said. "Everyone knows something is happening. Felda didn't come in. Nobody's saying officially why. There are people from administration walking around looking like they're waiting for something to fall on them." "Something is," she said. "Yeah." A pause. "Nora, is it over? I mean, is the—" He stopped, started again. "Is what you were doing finished?" "The acute part," she said. "The rest takes time." "Okay." Another pause. "Betty Simmons asked about you." She blinked. "What did she say?" "She asked if I'd heard from you. She said—" He stopped again, and she could hear him choosing words. "She said she documented everything correctly. She wanted you to know." Nora looked at the hospital through the windshield. Bet Simmons, charge nurse, 53, who ran a clean department and had told Nora that fast didn't mean much without following the hierarchy, and who had walked into a break room at 6:15 in the morning with a termination notice and had also, quietly, made sure the record was right. "Tell her I know," Nora said. "I will." A pause that was different from the others. Smaller, more personal. "What are you going to do now?" She thought about the question the way it deserved to be thought about. I don't know exactly, she said, but I think I'm going to stop running away from the parts of myself I'm good at. He was quiet for a moment. That's probably smart. Took me a while, she said. 2 weeks later, she was sitting across from Delaney in a conference room in a building in Northern Virginia that had no signage on the outside and a security desk whose protocols she approved of, and they were having a conversation she had not known she was going to have until approximately 5 days ago. Delaney was 51 now, with close-cropped salt and pepper hair and the particular quality of attention that Nora had always associated with her, the feeling of being seen clearly, not evaluated. She had brought 2 cups of coffee from somewhere outside the building and pushed one across the table and said nothing while Nora drank half of it. Then, "You know I'm not going to push you." "I know," Nora said, "and you know whatever you decide is the right decision." "I know that too." She put down the cup. "I've been thinking about what Moss said, about losing people because the person with the right answer was waiting for permission." "What did you conclude?" "That I spent 3 years trying to become someone who waits for permission," Nora said. "And 2 nights ago I saved a man's life because I didn't, and I lost my job because of it. And then the whole thing—" She stopped. "It's not a clean lesson. The lesson isn't always act without permission. That's not it." "What is it?" She looked at her coffee cup. "The lesson is knowing the difference between the rules that exist to protect people and the rules that exist to protect something else. And being honest with yourself about which one you're looking at." She paused. "I wasn't honest with myself for 3 years. I called it caution. It was mostly avoidance." Delaney looked at her for a moment. "And now?" "Now I'm done avoiding," Nora said. The conversation that followed lasted 90 minutes and covered things she would not discuss outside that room. At the end of it, she did not sign anything. There was nothing to sign yet. But she left with a clarity about the next 6 months that felt different from any plan she'd made in the previous 3 years. More honest about what she was and what she could do. Less concerned with containing it. The formal outcomes were public enough to find, for anyone looking. Gerald Foss entered a plea in federal court 11 weeks after his arrest. The charges were consolidated, the plea was negotiated, and the result was 8 years in federal prison with a financial penalty that stripped the consulting firm of its assets and froze accounts connected to 2 of the 4 programs the 2017 audit had flagged. His attorney called the plea a pragmatic resolution. The federal prosecutor called it accountability. The 31-word statement from Foss himself said nothing that Nora found worth reading twice. Marcus Felda's case moved more slowly because it always moved more slowly when the mechanism was professional misconduct rather than criminal prosecution. The medical board completed its initial review in 6 weeks and issued a formal finding of a sustained pattern of retaliatory action against nursing staff, connected to a clinical environment that had materially compromised patient safety in at least 3 documented instances. His emergency medicine privileges were suspended for 18 months, pending the outcome of a full hearing. The federal obstruction charge was filed separately and carried a maximum of 5 years. His attorney was negotiating. He had retained 2 lawyers and had not made a public statement. The thing Nora thought about later, when she thought about Felda, was not the suspension or the charges or the lawyers. It was the moment in the trauma bay when she had said tension pneumo, and he had looked at the monitor and done the math and said do it. He had been capable of the right call. He had also been capable of everything that followed. Both of those things were true, and neither one erased the other. Dennis Varick pled guilty to 2 counts and received a reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation with the federal investigation. His cooperation had, by the account she was given, been genuine and extensive. Colin Marsh spent 3 weeks in protective custody and then resumed his life with a formal commendation from the federal prosecutor's office. And more practically, a position with a federal security consulting firm that Rutherford had connected him to. He called Nora once, a month after everything, and the call was short and a little awkward, in the way that calls were awkward between people who had been important to each other during a compressed and extreme period and were now figuring out what they were in ordinary time. "I just wanted to say," he said, "that you're the reason it worked." "You're the reason it worked," she said. "You kept the record. For 4 years, nobody could do anything with it." "You kept it anyway," she said. "That's the part that mattered." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you going back?" he asked. "To the military thing?" "Something like it," she said. "Good," he said. I think you should. Gloria Reyes and Victor Holt were both formally notified that their terminations from Harmon Valley had been determined to be retaliatory under federal employment protection statutes and that they were entitled to reinstatement or compensatory damages. Gloria Reyes called Nora on a Thursday morning and cried for about 45 seconds, and then collected herself and said, "I just want my nursing license to show what actually happened." "It will," Nora said. "They made me feel like I was crazy," Gloria said. "For 2 years I thought I'd missed something clinical, that there was a good reason." "There was no good reason," Nora said. "I know that now." A pause. "I needed to hear it from someone else." Nora understood that. She understood it in the way she understood the specific weight of carrying a correct perception that the people around you were determined to call wrong. The particular exhaustion of trusting your own read when everything institutional was telling you to doubt it. "You weren't crazy," Nora said. "You were right." Pete Okafor finished his residency the following year and matched into emergency medicine, which surprised no one who had watched him work. He sent Nora a message when the match results came out. A short text, 3 sentences, and she sent back 5 words. "Good, the ER needs you." He did not reply immediately, which meant he was already at the hospital. She went to Boise in April, 3 weeks after the conversation with Delaney. Her mother made her sleep in the twin bed, which was exactly as uncomfortable as she'd predicted, and also exactly right in the way that childhood beds were right, grounding in a physical sense she hadn't had since Portland. She stayed for 10 days. She ran in the mornings through neighborhoods she'd grown up in, the mountains visible on clear days, the air different from North Carolina in a way that reset something she hadn't known needed resetting. Her mother didn't ask many questions. She made food and watched television with Nora, and on the 4th day said, over dinner, "You seem different." "From when?" "From the last 3 years." Her mother looked at her. "You seem more like yourself." Nora looked at her plate. "I think I was trying to be less of myself," she said, "and it didn't work." Her mother nodded once, the way she had always nodded when Nora said something she'd been waiting for Nora to figure out. "It usually doesn't," she said, and went back to eating. The velvet case went back into her bag when she left Boise. Not into a box this time, into the bag she was carrying. She was not the same person who had driven to North Carolina with 2 bags in the trunk and a plan to be smaller. She was not a different person either. The 3 years were real, the reasons were real, the things that had happened that made her need to step back were real. None of that was erased. But she understood now that stepping back was something you did temporarily to recover, not permanently, to disappear. And she had stayed in the disappearing longer than it had served her. She had been afraid, after what happened, of what she was capable of how fast she could move, how certain she could be, how quickly she could override everything around her when she was the person who could see most clearly. What she'd learned in a trauma bay on a Tuesday night, and in the 2 weeks that followed, was that the speed and the certainty were not the danger. The danger was using them for the wrong thing. The danger was a physician who was certain he knew more than the nurses because the institution had told him that for 19 years, and who had been right often enough that the certainty had calcified into something that could no longer be questioned. The danger was a man on a board who had started with financial self-interest and had organized his entire environment around protecting it until protecting it meant reaching into an ICU. Her certainty in that trauma bay had saved a man's life. Felde's certainty over 19 years had put 3 nurses out of work and suppressed clinical observations in patients who deserved better. The difference was not the certainty itself. It was what the certainty was in service of. She had known that once. In the forward bases and the field work and the years of doing medicine in conditions where there was no room for ego because ego got people killed. She had known it, and then she had lost something that broke her open and she had retreated into smallness because she didn't trust herself anymore. She trusted herself now. Not blindly. She was not interested in blind, but clearly. The way she'd been able to see a tracheal deviation and a tremor pattern and a man dying on a gurney and know exactly what to do. That was not nothing. That was not something to file away in a box on a shelf. That was who she was. The last call she made before she left Boise was to Rutherford. 6 weeks, she said. I need 6 weeks before I start anything formal. 6 weeks is fine, he said. And I want to consult on the training side, not just operations. The medical training for forward personnel. The curriculum hasn't been updated in 4 years and there are gaps. I know, he said. I was going to ask you about that. Ask me in 6 weeks, she said. A pause. How are you doing, Captain? She looked out the window of her mother's kitchen, at the backyard she'd played in as a kid, at the mountains in the distance showing snow still on the upper ridgeline even in April. I'm working on it, she said. That's all any of us are doing, he said. She smiled a little. 6 weeks, she said, and ended the call. Here's what she carried forward. The knowledge that she had walked into a room where a man was dying and done the thing that needed doing, and the cost had been her job and the price had been paid, and it had been worth it. Not because the story ended well, endings were not the point, but because in the moment when it had mattered most, she had been exactly who she was, and she had not waited for permission. The knowledge that 4 years of entries in a small notebook, kept by a man at a security desk who had no authority and no platform, and no guarantee that anyone would ever read it, had been the thing that made the whole structure visible. Quiet, persistent, unrecognized, until it wasn't. The knowledge that 3 women and a man she had never met before. The week of her firing had seen the same wrong things she'd seen and had carried the weight of them alone, and that being told you were right after 14 months of silence was not nothing, was in fact the thing that mattered more than any of the legal proceedings. And the knowledge, the one she would take the longest to fully absorb, that the skills she had spent 3 years trying to contain were not the dangerous thing, that the dangerous thing was the waste of them, that somewhere, in some room, at some hour, there was always going to be a person on a gurney and an alarm going off and a question of who in that room could see what needed doing. She intended to be that person. Not perfectly, not without cost, not in the clean and frictionless way that stories sometimes described, where the hero knew everything and paid nothing and arrived at the end unscarred. She would arrive at the ends of things the way she had arrived at all the hard ends in her life, knowing more than she had before, carrying more than she would have chosen to, tired in ways that didn't fully resolve. But present, useful. Hers. The nurse they threw away had not disappeared. She had just been waiting for herself.